One, this is Group 5, and we'll be presenting on nationalism in South Africa. You're welcome. Hope you enjoy the presentation. Okay, to begin with, we'll start by defining the term nationalism. What is nationalism? Nationalism, to be precise, should I say, it's like more of patriotism. This is a situation where one shows loyalty and allegiance to a nation or a nation state, to to either an individual or to a group of people. Later, after defining the term nationalism, we've seen it's more of patriotism, one shows loyalty to a nation or a group of individuals. We'll come to discuss how nationalism began in South Africa. We can say that nationalism began as, before it was seen as a in political action as well as ideological elements, such that its main aim was to improve the status and rights and positions of Africans in a state where there was intrusion by the whites, that is the colonialists. Well, we can discuss now the aims of nationalism in South Africa, and generally, as I've began by saying that nationalism was triggered by the invasion or intrusion of the whites. So the main purpose of nationalism first was to do away with discrimination. As we all know, there was a lot of discrimination between the Afrikaners and the whites, and also to remove that inequality and barriers based on either gender, the race, and everything. I can conclude by saying that there are more aims of this nationalism movement that was also to unite the indigenous groups as well as to fight for their rights in a country that was intruded or invaded by the whites, and also build an non-racist, non-sexist democracy. That is more related to the first one, that was to remove discrimination and build a nation that is free from inequality.
Hello guys, I'm Daniel Kipchirchir and we are going to talk about the factors that facilitated nationalism in South Africa. The factors include missionary churches, World Wars I and II, the ideology of Pan-Africanism, the League of Nations or the United Nations, and colonial oppression. So let's talk about how colonial oppression affected nationalism. It gave a negative, exploitative, and oppressive experience because of the following reasons. One, the Africans were humiliated, and two, the denigration and distortion of the African culture. We have the lands being confiscated, and the Africans were also forced to provide cheap labor in their farms. High taxes such as hard tax and betrayal of their leaders. The resistance against colonialists was military unsuccessful since they were brutally suppressed. As an aftermath, associations were later formed to fight for the freedom of Africa. So, under missionary churches, it is evident that other countries, missionaries proceeded their colonial takeovers or came immediately a country was declared a colony. As a result, they played the following roles in facilitating nationalism in South Africa. One, disintegrating African communities that led to Africans losing their faith in the ancestral spirits. Example, in the experience of the Majimaji Rebellion and the Sembene. Education provided by church schools, which had the following goals. One was to provide basic literacy to Africans in order to absorb religious education and training so that they could spread the gospel. And two, imparting the values of the Western society. Three, it made Africans believe colonization was for good of Africans. This made the Africans resent sins they were treated inferior, hence demanded for their own churches. Under World Wars One and Two, uh, wars had tremendous impacts on African nationalism in several important ways. It gave Africans modern military skills in battle and demonstrated leadership abilities. The world was the world wars depleted their economic facilities, hence they could not produce enough for themselves. This in turn diverted all resources to Africans for them to provide for those countries. Hence, this made the Africans feel superior and got the urge to resist and fight back for the freedom experience gained in the world wars.
I'm going to take you through the summary of the factors that led to nationalism in South Africa. Under these, we have economic, political, and social. The first one is intensive land alienation, where Africans were given little land, though they were the majority, while in the few sectors were given much land. Number two was forced labor. Forced labor, where people in South Africa were forced to do work into the white economic center, for example, into the mines while they were paid low wages. Number three was discovery of minerals and consolidation of capital. Discovery caused a serious effect to the life of the black people in South Africa because they were forced to dispose their land and to work in the mines. Number four was introduction to settler agriculture, where the whites had to occupy the fertile lands of indigenous of South Africa. Number five, British control of the Cape. The friendship between British who had occupied the Cape and the Boers who was short-lived after the British established at the Cape. The Boers were penetrating further. We go to the political factors. Number one, the role played by international political party. These two parties were PSC and ANC that were formed by blacks in South Africa so as to fight against the white men in South African regime. Number two, role played by strong and able leaders like Nelson Mandela, who united people, solidified and bring awareness and consciousness among the people about European exploitation. Number three was emergence of new powers such as USR and USSR, which replaced British, France and German. The situation contributed too much to the South Africa to search for their independence. Number four, the loss of independence to foreigners and introduction of foreign system of government caused a feeling of resistance among rulers and the people of South Africa. The people were tired about the assassination of the political leaders in South Africa, such as Steve Biko of 1977. The contribution made by Kwame Nkrumah as the charismatic leader in Africa and the world at large. After helping Ghana to gain their independence, he contributed too much for the rise of nationalism, for the rise of independence of African countries. Number seven, role played by organizations of African unions. AU in 1963, which provided a moral and material support to African freedom fighters like Walter Silulu and Nelson Mandela. Now we go to the social factors. Number one, colonial education many Africans had received. As a result, they become with new ideas. Number two, a question of apartheid. It was a system of racial segregation in South Africa which was introduced in 1948. Number three, the role of writers. These were one of the intellectuals who contributed much to the rise of nationalism in South Africa. Number four, the class of settlement. An act put to end the diverse areas that determined one to live according to the race. Each race was allocated its own area. Number five, the role played by churches. The churches to which they belonged usually supported the principle for which they fought, such as those related to Blood Act. Number six, the issue of language. People were forced to use English and not Afrikaners in all aspects of communication, hence they reacted and waged resistance to eliminate that system. Number 7, the role of songs and poems. These were one of the factors that spread the idea of nationalism in South Africa. Many artists composed songs and poems of which they carried a nationalism idea in South Africa. Number 8, poor working conditions with their poor environments like poor healthy services and houses. Blacks in South Africa were not happy on this situation and therefore the movement started.
Hello, I will take you through occurrence. Uh, Nationalism in South Africa was founded by J.B.M. Hudson as an African nationalist party. He further led the Nationality Party in 1915 and 1920 elections. His aim was to create a South African independent from the British influence. In 1924, he defeated South African Party led by Jan Smuts after he had used force to end the Rand revolt of white miners in 1922 and stayed in power for 1 year in coalition government with the Labour Party. Former nationalist Afrikaners parties. Number 1, Afrikaner Party, which led from 1949 to 1951. Number 2 is Estiquette National Party. We also have number 3, which is Conservative Party, which led from 1982 to 2002. The fourth party is Front National, which led from 2013 to 2020. Now I'll take you through challenges faced by the nationalists in South Africa. The first challenge is the colonial government employed the method of banning of political organization as a means of frustrating the struggle for independence, e.g. ANC, PAC, and CP party. The second one is the nationalists were harassed, arrested, and detained or jailed by the authorities, e.g. Mandela, Oliver, were forced to flee or exile their country in search of political asylum and restriction. The third one is a lot of violence was unleashed by them, such as killing of many nationalists and Africans, such as Steve Biko, and the 1960 Sharpeville massacre of school children spreading fear. We have the fourth one, deliberate policy of divide and rule was employed to weaken African unity, e.g. establishment of black homeland or Bantustans, which eventually brewed the conflict between ANC and IFP of Buthelezi. The fifth one, challenge is the racist regime used emergency power to harass and frustrate nationalist leaders. The sixth challenge is they also faced the problem of lack of money and other resources which slugged the struggle. Nationalists were denied access to state-owned radio and other outlets. Those media were used instead as means of propaganda against the nationalists. Another challenge is banning of trade union also frustrated the activities of nationalists, who they were allowed to exceed while monitored by the police. The next challenge is they also faced a challenge of movement restriction through past laws that were introduced. The 10th one is African journalists were harassed and their newspapers proscribed by the government.